This video is going to begin the lesson dealing with Chapter 3. In Chapter 3, we're going to start talking about consumer theory. But before we go too far, I want to let you in on a little bit of advice. Something that if you can kind of keep in mind throughout the remainder of this class, you'll be better off for it. And that little secret is that economics is just common sense ideas with fancy terms and fancy mathematics tied to it. So let me tell you kind of a little bit about what consumer economics is and the microeconomics of consumption is. You see, consumers attempt to maximize their satisfaction given a limited budget. That's consumer economics. That's the basis of consumer theory, is that consumers attempt to maximize their satisfaction given a limited budget. Now let's put that in layman's terms. Basically, it means that consumers are trying to get the most bang for their buck. It means that everybody is faced with a finite amount of money that they can spend. They can only spend so much money, but yet they are trying to take that money and enhance their lives to the best they possibly can. They're trying to get the most enjoyment out of life given that limited amount of money that they have to spend. Pretty basic stuff. Now that we've kind of covered the basic stuff, let's dive into actual consumer theory and start getting into the more technical terms surrounding all this and the fancy mathematics to go with it. So whenever we start, we're going to say that economic behavior is a stimulus response activity. And what a stimulus response activity is basically because something happens, something else responds to that. Something else happens. So if we look at something like biology, we can look at, say, light hits a plant and that causes photosynthesis. That is the stimulus. That light hitting that plant is the stimulus. The response is that plant then takes that light, uses photosynthesis, and causes the plant to grow. So we have a stimulus, light hitting the plant, and a response. That plant is now growing. Well, we can apply that same stimulus response activity aspect to economics. So, what would you do if the price of ice cream fell? What if the price of ice cream was $5 and all of a sudden it's now $2.50? Think you'd buy more of it? Well, chances are you would. The law of demand actually states that you would. That as prices fall, people will buy more. And it may not be you individually. Maybe you don't like ice cream as much as the next person, but you individually may not be buying the ice cream, but as a whole, people begin to buy more ice cream because it's cheaper. So, say prices for ice cream fall. This is a stimulus. Something caused that price of ice cream to fall. Well, in response, what do? People buy more ice cream. Just the same thing about, imagine if you're going to go to the store and buy something and something's on sale and they say buy 2 for 1. Well, what do? You buy both boxes. You buy 2 for the price of 1. Because that price was cut in half, that stimulus of that price was in half, people bought more of that particular item. So in economics, we have a stimulus response activity. Now, if we dive into it a little bit more, next we're going to analyze natural sciences versus social sciences. So we know from Chapter 1 that economics is a social science, and that agricultural economics is an applied social science, and that a social science deals with human behavior. So what are the natural sciences? The natural sciences are those such as biology, chemistry, and physics. All 3 of these natural sciences can actually be studied in a controlled environment. So if you ever take a college class of biology, chemistry, or physics, or even in high school, if you've ever taken these, each one of these typically has a lab component with it. Whenever you're dealing with biology, you're looking at the study of life, and often you're doing that in a controlled environment. You're inside of a lab that is a controlled environment. Chemistry, you're performing chemical reactions inside of a lab. Physics, you're doing the same thing. Because you're looking at this stimulus response activity and you're looking at it in a controlled environment, you can set up laws and parameters that hold true every single time because there is nothing else to affect it. But let's compare that back to a social science. A social science is something like economics. Now, economics cannot be studied in a controlled environment. It's very difficult to study these social sciences in a controlled environment. Well, why is that? Why can we not study social sciences in a controlled environment? Well, very simply, social sciences are the study of human behavior. Just like what we were talking about up here with this ice cream, we were looking at human behavior, that people bought more ice cream as a response to this prices falling, and that's human behavior. Well, how can you really study human behavior in a lab? You really can't. You can't lock humans up in this lab and tell them, okay, here's the parameters, go out and do it. It just doesn't work, because humans need to live their own lives outside of a lab. But if you say, all right, well, we're going to set up this test or this experiment, it's going to be in a lab, but as soon as the experiment is done, they're allowed to leave. Well, there might have been something that happened in this human's life that affected how they reacted in this experiment. So really and truthfully, human behavior, it cannot be studied in a lab. It cannot be studied in a controlled environment, because as humans, we have so many things and so many external things that would not allow us to be contained to this controlled environment. So within economics, especially microeconomics, we have two different studies. We have microeconomics of production, or production economics. We also have consumer economics, or microeconomics of consumption. So production economics is it's more looking at businesses. It's looking at how a business will take inputs and convert them into outputs. This is a technical relationship, and it's looking at how many inputs you need to produce an output, and then what price are you charging for this output, and things of that nature. And this technical relationship is a lot easier to examine than it will be to examine consumer economics. And the reason that is so much easier to examine, it's easier to examine this production economics, because whenever we're dealing with businesses, how do we measure a business? Often we measure the business with money. These outputs, inputs, and outputs all cost a certain amount. So we can measure how much we're paying in inputs and how much we're paying in outputs. We can track the money to examine production economics. But whenever we're dealing with consumer economics, whenever we're dealing with how a consumer allocates their budget to maximize their satisfaction, to maximize their enjoyment given their limited budget. But here poses a question. How do you measure satisfaction? How can you measure that a bowl of ice cream gives me so much satisfaction, and is that amount of satisfaction the same as your amount of satisfaction? How can we measure how much enjoyment we're getting off of something? Well, the simple truth is, cannot observe the process of connecting economic stimulus to the decision. We cannot observe, we cannot tell how much satisfaction the individual gets off of a bowl of ice cream. We can't measure how much satisfaction they get off of pizza versus hamburgers. And then on top of that, even if we could measure it, even if we could say that I got 10 units of satisfaction off of this bowl of ice cream, and that, say, Jim Bob got 10 units of satisfaction as well. Well, what's to say that his units of satisfaction are the same as mine? Maybe he says, yeah, I get 10 units of satisfaction, but what's to say his units are equal to mine? It's like saying, yeah, this item is 10 in length. Well, are we talking about inches? Or are we talking about millimeters? Or even millimeters versus centimeters? It's really hard to identify in that each individual is different, so we can't really measure satisfaction. It's been tried, and it's next to impossible, if it is impossible. At least we haven't found out yet how to do that. But then it also brings up this other aspect of, why did Robin buy more ice cream than Willis, even though they both had the same price and the same income? How can we measure that? How can we quantify that? How can we go about and actually place a value or a measurement on that? Because here we have two individuals buying a different amount of ice cream, but they're set up in the exact same environment. Remember, that's that human behavior, that amount that cannot be studied in a lab. So we now know that production economics is a lot easier to measure, just simply because we can track the amount of money. While as consumer economics, well, we can't really measure satisfaction, so we cannot really measure that or we cannot really observe the process of connecting this economic stimulus to the decision, because the economic stimulus for Robin and for Willis were the exact same, but yet their decision was different. So as we go through here, and we're going to talk about some of the assumptions of consumer theory, that very first assumption, that whenever we make these assumptions we need in order to make our consumer theory hold true. Because we can say that within the law of demand, that as prices rise, people will buy less of that particular good. Or as prices fall, people buy more. And that's indicated up here under this economic behavior. And that's a law. That's something that we know to be true. But does it always hold true? Not always. Sometimes we have different items that are different events that cause us to buy more even though the price might be going up or something like that. So these assumptions don't always hold true, but we make these assumptions to make our economic models actually hold true and explain the world in a much simplified and better way. One of the first assumptions and the main assumption is that people are rational. People are always rational. And I'll just pause so that way you can go ahead and laugh right now because I'm laughing in my head. People are not always rational. And I'm sure you might have been irrational at certain points in your life. And if you haven't been, you are one of a kind. And I guarantee you know somebody that has been irrational at some point in time. But consumer theory assumes that people are rational. Consumer theory also assumes that people attempt to maximize their satisfaction given a budget. This consumer theory says that people will always strive to be the happiest amount and obtain the most amount of satisfaction given their limited budget. And the last thing that I want to mention is a term here, the term utility. As we go through chapter 3, you're going to hear me, and through the rest of microeconomics, you're going to hear me use the word utility a lot. And utility is simply another word for satisfaction. So I will be using these terms interchangeably. If I say utility, just know it means satisfaction. Just know that satisfaction is also the same thing as utility. It's just simply another word for satisfaction.